Okay, so we are here to talk about self-regulation in the early years. We're bringing evidence from the Education Endowment Foundation's guidance report on self-regulation and metacognition. Self-regulation and metacognition have gone to the top of the EEF Toolkit as evidenced for the greatest impact, in particular for children who are coming from backgrounds where, in particular for closing the gap for children who come from low income backgrounds. So self-regulation and metacognition, particularly powerful strategies. We also know that self-regulation and metacognition is particularly effective strategy in primary. And we wanted to talk today about how you specifically translate that for the early years foundation stage in particular, because when we talk about self-regulation, often we're using the same terminology, but we are oh, sorry, I got a bit of an echo. But we are talking about slightly different things if we're coming from different phases of education. For those of you, I'm aware that we do have some of an international audience with us today, but for those of us who are working within the UK context, part of the reason that self-regulation executive function has become such a significant topic for discussion at the moment is that it is part of the new early years foundation stage profile and part of the early learning goals in that we are all working towards. So everyone in early years has to think about it, but it is also important to recognize that we should think about it, that it's a powerful thing for us to be considering in terms of supporting our children moving forward. We also know that self-regulation develops very rapidly in the ages of 4 to 5, so it is particularly critical for those of us who are working with children in that age group. The slide includes what it looks like in the early years foundation stage documentation, but we're going to talk about it in a kind of slightly broader sense than that. I'm sorry for those of you that have got something a bit funny in the middle of your screen. I have to unshare this. Have you got the thing? You don't? Okay. So I'm just going to pass over now to Sarah Baker, who is going to talk to us about self-regulation from the perspective of the Peddle Centre at Cambridge.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. And I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about self-regulation and the associated skills of executive functions and metacognition. I'm a developmental psychologist, and when we think in psychology about self-regulation, often we think about it in kind of 3 categories, which of course overlap with each other. That's emotion regulation, cognitive regulation, and behavioral regulation. And the idea is that within each of these different domains of emotion, cognition, and behavior, you have the ability and the developing ability as a young child to adapt what might be initially kind of instincts and impulses to gradually become more context appropriate and to make decisions about what you're going to do rather than just responding in the moment in kind of based on your intuition or your gut feeling. So I think many people in education will be familiar with the ideas of plan, do, review, and that is certainly related to self-regulation. It's a kind of strategy that means you first think about what you're going to do, and then you do it, and then you think about what you've done. So again, not just doing the first thing that comes to mind or doing what you've always done because it's a habit, but instead making deliberate decisions, weighing up different options. For very young children, that can mean something happening very, very quickly, actually, but when you sit down to observe quite carefully, you can see that there are steps that they're taking For them, it might even be somewhat subconscious, but they're making decisions. They're working towards a goal, and they're sometimes even noticing and correcting themselves and trying different ways of doing things, while also pushing through when they face a challenge. So they don't just kind of stop and get frustrated and give up, but they may feel those emotions and still carry on and try other ways of doing things. So that's kind of a general way of thinking about self-regulation. We'd like to show you a video, and I would invite you, while the video is playing, to think about what the child is doing, and to think about whether you can see any evidence of self-regulation here, whether the child is making decisions, whether they're, oh, well, I won't say, I'll actually just let you watch and then you can see what you see. If you have ideas, you could put them in the chat. Okay, well, the celebration was long and worthwhile. I'm glad we captured that on the video as well. So I see somebody in the chat has said, testing out ideas, adjusting, persevering, achieving a goal, trying out different things, problem solving. Absolutely, we see all of those things. And another question for you is, what was the adult's role here? I'd invite you to think about that. So we're focused on the child's self-regulation. What is the adult doing that makes it possible for all of those opportunities here? Somebody says to step back, to observe, letting the child do it, and encouragement. Great. So absolutely. I mean, in research across lots of different types of settings, we see that there is an association between giving children those opportunities to try things out, to explore, to do things in different ways, to correct themselves, and then the children's developing ability to self-regulate. So as we think about how this connects with the early years foundation stage in the, just trying to move this box so I can see my slides. Well, I know essentially what's in there. As we think about how this relates to self-regulation in the foundation stage, you could have a look at the words here. I won't read them all out, but we do see some of the same things you were noticing in the chat. For example, solving problems, achieving a goal, looking for those opportunities to prompt the children instead of just simply telling them what to do next or even doing it for them. And again, I always want to draw our attention back to the role of the adult, because as much as the children do need the space and the opportunities to practice their emotion regulation or their cognitive regulation or their behavioral regulation, the role of the adult in offering that little bit of support when things are difficult is really, really key. And so it's not just about letting them get on with things, but having having an eye on opportunities for scaffolding and doing that in an appropriate way so the children experience some challenge, but that it's not going to overwhelm them. Those are the kind of zones where we know they'll be able to build their self-regulation skills. There's another part also of the foundation stage in the characteristics of effective teaching and learning, which is about playing and exploring, which I'm not sure whether, perfect, it's the next slide on here. And here again, we have ideas and examples where through children's play and through their exploration, they're given the chance to develop self-regulation. For example, they can plan and think ahead about what they'll do with objects. And adults can play a role there in helping the children to make a plan, not telling them what they should do, but supporting them and guiding them and prompting them to think, what character am I going to be before I run over and start, engaging in my pretend play, or drawing a picture about something we want to build before we build it. Those are really simple ways to get children to make a plan, make decisions, and all of these things that can sound quite sophisticated, but actually they work really well in just everyday play. More examples here about supporting children to make choices, and then talking to them about those choices and developing when we talk about metacognition, it's thinking about thinking. So through conversations with adults, children can practice thinking about thinking and what worked well for me this time, what did I do last time that I'd like to try differently, etc. Now, let's think a little bit about conditions for self-regulation and what might make it easier for children to self-regulate, or what might make it a little bit harder. Can you think of things that could be going on either in a classroom or in a setting, even at home, any kind of daily environments that children encounter? What do you think might support self-regulation or get in the way of it? So right away, we have people talk about being overwhelmed or sensory overload, overstimulation. Yeah, okay, lots and lots of ideas. Another theme that I saw was about actually hunger and being tired and these sorts of things. Those are all factors. Coming back to just to pick up on the idea of sensory overload, when children are engaging in self-regulation, this goes for adults too, by the way, you might notice, if you were to stop and think about it, that you often talk to yourself when something's a little bit challenging, you're trying to navigate your way through, or even if you're just, doing your shopping and you're kind of trying to remember to do certain things, get certain things on the list, or go back and find that item you missed. It's the same with children. They can use self-talk to guide their actions. And if there's a lot of noise around them, and if there's a lot of kind of, distractions, then that's just one example of something that could be harder to do. It's harder to hear yourself think literally if there's all these other things kind of going on. So the other example the other kind of theme I saw, people were talking about being, tired and hungry, etc. And that's true. I mean, if you're, you kind of have to be somewhat, physically satisfied to a certain extent, like to be able to kind of focus and think about what you're doing next. There's all kinds of examples here. I'm loving all of this. I'm going to move on, but just before I do, to pick up on the emotional side, people are talking about things like worries at home, and that's right. So if you have, it's the same kind of parallel with overstimulation on the cognitive side. If you also have overstimulation, so to speak, on the emotional side, then it can be harder. It's kind of like your glass is so full that then regulating those emotions can become difficult in a variety of different moments throughout the day. Okay. I think at this point we have, yes, we've already talked about how self-regulation appears in the early learning goals. Just before I hand back over, does anybody want to ask any questions? And I mean, there's a lot of people in the call, so I may not be able to answer 150 questions, but I'll try to take a few if you'd like to put them in the chat. Just while you're thinking about your questions, somebody has commented that I've talked a little bit about the conditions that make it easier or harder for a child to self-regulate. And somebody said, well, some children are just better at this than others. And that's true. I mean, there will be a huge variety of kind of capacity for self-regulation. And that's definitely something to be aware of and something to look for and consciously think, is what I'm seeing on the surface here, is that because of the child's capacity for self-regulation, and how can we help them? Okay, books on self-regulation in the early years. I think what we'll do is, rather than me rattling off a list of books, we can put those into the Padlet, which can be sent around after the call, and we can recommend some readings. I'm sure we have a whole bunch of things we can recommend. Okay, there's a conversation within the chat, which is wonderful. Shall I just take one more question? Okay, so I guess I'm being asked to think about how this relates to behavior management, and behavior management is not my area of expertise, but what I can say is that self-regulation isn't, at least in the way I think about it as a developmental psychologist, it's not about compliance with what other people want you to do. It's on the contrary very much about supporting children as individuals who are, respected people in a learning community, supporting them to understand themselves as a learner, to understand what they want to achieve, what they would like to achieve, how they can get there, and really empowering them and giving them that agency. So it's definitely not, from my point of view, about having kids just sit and be quiet and do what they're told all the time. Okay, wonderful. Lovely to have the opportunity to talk to you all. I'm going to hand it back over to Polly.
Thank you so much, Sarah. As a big part of our hope for this session was to provide early years practitioners with access to real research into self-regulation. I think it's something that we're all grappling with at the moment, and having that level of expertise is really fantastic. So thank you so much for that. I think that Sarah gave us quite a lot to think about, and also a good opportunity to reflect on our own practice. So some of those questions, what might be kind of barriers or enablers for children in self-regulating? What does self-regulation look like in practice, and how does self-regulation connect to the characteristics of effective teaching and learning? So I wanted to give everybody a chance now for a few minutes to go into some breakout groups, have a quick discussion about, I would say, those three key things. So what are the conditions that can support or challenge children in developing their self-regulation? What are the examples of supporting self-regulation that you can see in your practice? And what are your reflections on Sarah's thoughts on self-regulation as it relates to the characteristics of effective teaching and learning? We're going to put you into some breakout groups now, and we will bring you back in about 7 or 8 minutes time, I think. Hi, welcome back. It would be lovely to hear anything that you discussed in the breakout groups, any particular reflections that anybody had. It would be fantastic to see those in the chat. Whilst you are putting those in, I'll just explain a little bit about what we're going to cover next. So, as I mentioned earlier on, as we introduced the session, the information on self-regulation in early years that we're talking about today primarily comes from the Education Endowment Foundation's guidance report, which provides a particular focus on educational disadvantage and closing the gap, which we know exists already when children start in reception and when children are in early years pre-reception as well, and that self-regulation is known to be useful strategy in closing the gap, not only for itself, for its own purposes, but that it's also critical for progress in areas of the early years curriculum, including literacy and maths, but not only in the kind of academic outcomes, but also the characteristics of effective teaching and learning and the social and emotional side as well. It was a really interesting piece of research that was completed last year by one of my colleagues at the East London Research School, looking at how children's early development is affected by their home environment. And as I said at the beginning, I know quite a lot of people have joined since the beginning, since we started off the session. So as I said at the beginning, all of the resources that I mention or reference today will be on a Padlet that we will share with you. For those of you that are not familiar with a Padlet, it's just going to be a kind of an online home for all of the resources that we reference. So you don't need to go and find this individual article yourself. It will be there for you to look at. Sorry. Oh. Now my arrows aren't working at all. I might have to do something. There we go. Okay, so we know that self-regulation has a role in socio-emotional well-being. I think that's something that everybody reflected on as Sarah was talking as well, that there's a really clear connection between self-regulation and children's socio-emotional well-being, and there is evidence that it is not only kind of correlated at the time in early childhood education, but that it's also a strong predictor for future socio-emotional well-being as well, for school readiness, for academic performance, and for healthy socializing amongst peers. We talked a little bit earlier on about what impacts on self-regulation more broadly. So what could hypothetically be an impact on children's self-regulation, and people were reflecting on kind of additional needs, sensory overload, on children's kind of physical health and well-being as an impact on self-regulation. It would be really interesting to hear in your specific context in the chat as well, in your specific context, if there is anything that particularly impacts on children's self-regulation in your setting. So I can see some interesting comments about lockdown having an impact on self-regulation, and that's certainly something that I think, Fliss and I would say that we've seen in our context as well. Socialization outside of the family, and also, of course, then that places a particular pressure on the family circumstances as well, being conducive to the development of self-regulation as well. Transition times and transitions between activities, certainly something that children, it's a time when children need to really demonstrate that self-regulation. I guess they're good opportunities for developing self-regulation, but can certainly be, can provide challenges to children's self-regulation as well. Language barriers, communication and language, of course, is a huge area of focus for many of us in early childhood education right now, and is something that the Education Endowment Foundation, I know, has some particular guidance on with the early literacy report, and very much linked to self-regulation as well. So I think lots of people can really clearly relate to times when children may have barriers to developing their self-regulation. So again, yeah, Sarah talked about when some of these difficulties might take place. And actually, she very kindly kind of corrected me in my articulation on this slide that it's not really fair to talk about which children might have difficulties in self-regulation. I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that most children will have difficulties in self-regulation at one time or another. I think most adults probably have difficulty with self-regulation at one point or another. So I think it's fairer to articulate it as when might children have difficulties in developing self-regulation. And there is some research that demonstrates that the home background impacts on the development of self-regulation as well. It's not necessarily as straightforward as one might think, but there is evidence, for example, that living in homes with higher levels of damp, secondhand smoke, and higher emotional dysregulation as part of the environment could also have an impact on children's self-regulation as well, which I think is something that people have referenced in the chat here. The background that what children are bringing to school with them or to their early years setting with them is obviously something that impacts on their development whilst they're in the setting as well. I saw earlier on that some people asked about parents and self-regulation, and I can see another question in the chat there as well. And fortunately, I have Fliss is going to talk to us a little bit more about that, bringing some of her fantastic expertise to the conversation here on that one. The research also suggested that background noise was another significant predictor of emotional dysregulation trajectories, which also is kind of associated with evidence that noise exposure leads to diminished reading and language ability. And interestingly, not just self-regulation, but also kind of broader behavioural regulation and mental health as well. So homes with higher levels of TV noise experience greater instances of depression, anxiety, and aggression too. So there is a lot, I think, you know, the question about parents and practitioners needing to kind of co-regulate and work with children is really critical, but also, as we know, in early years, providing the physical environment, the contextual environment that gives children the support that they need in their development as well. And linked to that, so homes that were described as disorganized, or where parents talked about being unable to hear themselves think, a place that didn't feel calm, housed children who had lower levels of independence and higher levels of emotional dysregulation. It's really important to recognize that that does not necessarily the same as being in an overcrowded home, although some of the, you know, some levels of noise, for example, might be correlated. But that this is a kind of a useful check on potentially some of our cultural expectations. And if you read the article that covers this particular piece of research, it talks about how, you know, it is possible to have multiple occupancy where it's a very supportive environment for children's development, but so it's kind of an assumption checker, I guess, for us. So the research looked at a variety of different physical factors. And again, I know that's something that we all think about when we're developing our settings. 6 of them, so almost half, had a negative impact on children's developing self-regulation. And that also held true when it was controlled for socioeconomic, demographic, and geographic circumstances as well. So, you know, a highly stressful household that was considered to be where, you know, where the parents said that they couldn't hear themselves think, regardless of where it was or regardless of the income of the household, would have a potential negative impact on children's self-regulation as well. I am going to pass over now to my colleague Fliss, who is, I think, going to talk about something that lots of people are waiting to hear about. So there's anticipation for you, Fliss, in kind of developing independence and the role that adults play in their interactions in terms of developing self-regulation as well.
Hi everybody, thanks so much, Polly. Yeah, so brilliant to really consider all of these really, really important factors factors, those indoor physical factors, how the environment affects children's early development, absolutely critical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research around developing children's independent learning, and to sort of think a bit about metacognition and what that means as well. So if I can just move on to the next slide, Polly, thank you. So metacognition, I'm going to think about this because in terms of self-regulated learning, we can break this down into kind of 3 essential components. And so there's cognition, the mental process involved in knowing, understanding and learning, the metacognition, which is often, as Sarah had also said as well, defined as learning to learn and thinking about learning. You know, it's a complex array of skills and really ties into understanding dispositions about children's developing awareness of their own thinking, the knowledge about their own thinking and learning, and what kind of tasks and strategies that they can actually use. And there's also, we have to consider motivation and the affect, the willingness to engage our metacognitive and cognitive skills. So that's massive parts of self-regulated learning. And so a really big kind of goal of what we want children to achieve is to be independent learners. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about some research carried out by David Whitebread et al. This is from 2005 and a project that was carried out in Cambridgeshire with 3 to 5-year-old children. And what they kind of looked at were sort of like, I guess, sort of the aspects of pedagogy that really support self-regulated learning. Because it's really important to consider actually as well. And this is highlighted in the EEF's report on self-regulated learning and metacognition, is that, you know, impact of context is massive in terms of the development of young children's metacognitive behaviours. And this has clear implications on pedagogy, because for a long time it was believed that actually, you know, young children weren't really capable of metacognitive thought. But actually now we have a considerable body of evidence that supports the view that children at all sort of levels, stages, can benefit from explicit instruction in metacognition and self-regulation. And there's particular evidence around maths as well, which is really quite exciting, and where there is research to show the encouragement of young children articulating their strategies and how that is a key endeavour. So there has been lots of work carried out in this area. We're going to look at David Whitebread's research, where they looked at sort of independent learning events. So within the study, they catalogued 322 events of children aged 3 to 5, and they really looked at kind of what these pedagogical issues were in terms of, you know, sort of what were those, how was it characterized, how were the interactions characterized. Well, actually, if we look at this study, what was really interesting was that the children in particular really were able to be far more independent when the adults really kind of stood back a bit. Can we move on to the next slide for me, please, Polly? Thank you. I feel like Chris Whitty and, you know, all of the briefings at the moment. Thank you. And just the next one. Thank you. So what we learned about this was really quite interesting, is that in this context of adults really thinking about how to support children's independent learning and encouraging those metacognitive abilities, the children demonstrated that actually they learned so much from watching one another, that actually when they were given those opportunities to make their own choices, to be involved in decision making, they were incredibly focused. They were quite organised in how they sort of pursued their plans and their own kind of agenda. They were very persistent, and actually this occurred over surprisingly long periods of time. Now, many of you will be able to attest to this anecdotally in your early years context, about how you really attune to children and think about that kind of pedagogy and the relationships in which the adults develop with the children, but also giving them this space and time and really thinking about how to enable children to consider being independent, giving them those opportunities. What was also interesting in the study was that actually sometimes when an adult became involved, sometimes the children then became a little bit more inclined to say that actually they couldn't do something, which is really interesting, isn't it? But actually, if they were working with a peer, with another child, they were more likely to be confident and less likely to question what they were doing. Quite interesting in how we can support that peer interaction and how sort of mimicking and imitating other children can actually support children to gain confidence in what they can do. Really, really interesting. On the next slide, there's just a few more points from this particular study around effective responses. So the most effective response that practitioners were able to give in this situation was really to actually direct them to another child. So when the child was asking for help, they actually found that it was really powerful to refer them to another child who had greater skill or competence or expertise in a particular area. And that was really interesting. And I actually, thinking about it now, anecdotally, this kind of happened yesterday in my classroom. So I work with children aged 2 to 4. And yesterday I was with a group of 3.5-year-olds who were really experimenting with folding paper and creating different things with tape and so forth. And actually one of the children had decided to make a handbag, and she wanted to seal up the edges of the paper, and she asked me for help. And I noticed that the other child next to her had already gone one step further with this, which was quite interesting, and had figured it out how to kind of attach some tape on the edge of the paper, fold it over, so she had like a little pocket. And so we had this kind of conversation, and I said, actually, if you look at what Evelyn's doing, she's already started one step ahead of what you're doing. So if you talk to her about it, you can help each other. And I got this series of kind of photos of them working through this problem. And it was so interesting because when I was observing it and just kind of tuning in and watching, I think that, you know, the explanation from the other child was just pitched just right for her friend. It was really, really interesting. So actually, again, thinking about when do we intervene, you know, interacting or interfering, being very, very sensitive about that, particularly when it comes to disputes and disagreements in any kind of collaborative play. Space and time, massively important to give children this opportunity to resolve those issues. And it's also about how we can ensure that we give children the right kind of language to use. What are we modeling for them? There is also an important distinction to consider when we're thinking about praise and really powerful constructive feedback and encouragement. So we want children to feel empowered. We want to enable them. And actually, if we give praise, sort of empty praise, good boy, well done, wow, that's nice, you know, it's not really giving children anything to kind of hook into. Whereas actually, if we can give them information and feedback that really supports the child to understand what you noticed about their learning and how you can comment and build on that, that can really support independence as well. So it supports children to think about their own processes, to think about their own learning, to reflect, to become self-regulated and metacognitive. So in the end, the other key thing that they found from this particular study was thinking about those children who differed in terms of how they responded to different types of tasks. So those that are open-ended or child-initiated, and those that needed that much more scaffolded, supportive structure that was established by an adult. Both kinds of opportunities need to be provided. There's a really interesting paper, and this is relating to maths education, by 2 researchers in America, Clements and Sarama, who talk about this idea of the false dichotomy. So this idea that actually it's either or. We need to make sure we're providing both of these kinds of experiences so that we can really support children at all of those different kind of stages as well. And again, nothing really new, but something to reaffirm what we know and how to kind of feel empowered and how we can support each other as educators in our journey in supporting children to become self-regulated learners. So just to kind of follow up on a little bit more of a recent project that built on this initial research, looking specifically at maths. Some key features came out of another project which really identified this effective pedagogy for self-regulation. So actually distilling it down into 4 key things. So this was Whitebread and Coltman looking at the pedagogy around supporting metacognition and self-regulation in mathematical contexts. But actually building on the study found that providing children with emotional warmth and security was absolutely vital, giving children a sense of autonomy and feelings of control, providing cognitive challenge and supporting children to talk about their learnings, that they are more aware of their own mental processes of thinking and learning. Really, really important. And within that, we have to consider what the environment looks like. So, independent access to resources, that gives feelings of control and autonomy, and thinking carefully about how you structure your enabling environment for children, the nature of the opportunities and activities children have, and the quality of social and educational interactions, really thinking about how to support children to resolve those conflicts. So really quite interesting aspects of pedagogy for self-regulation and metacognition. Now, what this makes me think of, and yes, so someone's just popped up in the chat about tools of the mind and the high scope approach. So two very kind of key approaches to really supporting children's self-regulated thinking and learning. It also makes me think about Iram Siraj and Edwin Mellowish's work on sustained shared thinking as well. And when you look at their STEW scale, which is the sustained shared thinking and emotional well-being scale, just looking at those quality indicators to support those things. What's really interesting is that they also highlight these key features as well. This idea of emotional warmth and security, the relationships, autonomy, giving children those opportunities, really thinking, what is that cognitive challenge? And so sustained shared thinking, which many of you will have heard about, is a term that was first coined by Iram Siraj in 2002 during the Researching Effective Pedagogy in the Early Years project. It's all about how in an episode where two or more individuals work together intellectually, in an intellectual way to solve a problem, clarify something, evaluate an activity, develop a narrative. But the point is that both of those people must be contributing to the thinking. So that's really, really powerful in terms of thinking about children reflecting on their own learning as well. And sustained shared thinking can happen, it doesn't have to be an extended or long kind of conversation or interaction. The key is contribution to thinking. It must develop and extend, and it can happen between children. So Evelyn and Alina, who I was working with yesterday, definitely had an episode of sustained shared thinking within that pedagogy of those relationships that we cultivate in our setting and those opportunities to foster that independence. It sometimes may include standing back and allowing that child to explore and familiarize and solve problems and think by themselves or with another child, as well as that intervening and supporting. And it's that idea of really thinking about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, scaffolding, really powerful approaches. And again, many of these things will be things that you're familiar with and that are resonating, but it's so powerful to know that the evidence really backs this up. So we will put in the Padlet a link to something that I've got some information about the STEW scale and sustained shared thinking as well, just so people have that information. So we're going to have a little bit of a think about parents and parental understanding. So if we just skip to the next slide, some of you may have been aware of the 5 big questions insight. So the Royal Foundation carried out a survey after a rapid review of evidence, looking into the views of parents. And what's really interesting is that 500,000 people filled out this survey and gave their views about the early years. And it's really interesting actually, because we need to consider, building on the EEF's report on working with parents to support children's learning. It's a challenge. We really need to think about how we can enable parents. And so again, it touches back on some of these things that we've looked at already in terms of home conditions and other kind of really significant environmental challenges as well. But working with parents is so important. And again, something that many of you will be very passionate and knowledgeable about. But the key thing is that within this study, what we learned from this report was that actually, the parents really kind of understand that it is massively important to support their children. However, those first 5 years of childhood are more pivotal for development, future health and happiness than any other moment in our lifetime. And so Enriching environments and experiences throughout these years provides the essential foundations for children to become healthy, happy and productive adults. Again, something that many of you will feel very, very passionate about. So from this particular research, there were three main themes that emerged, and it was about the importance of promoting education and disseminating the evidence, as we are tonight, on how important early years is to parents and parents of the future, and therefore the whole of society. Another really important theme was about how we need to cultivate and sustain support networks of parents and encouraging society as a whole to be more supportive of parents, carers and families. Because what we know is that actually that responsive, nurturing caregiving is absolutely vital. So if we're thinking about the development of self-regulation, everything starts in infancy, doesn't it? When we think about that attunement and that relationship, that nurturing, loving, responsive relationship that parents, that caregivers provide for their youngest children. And what's really important about that is that there were many parents who completed the survey that actually didn't really realize just how powerful the 0 to 5 period is. So the recognition of importance of early years is far from universal. So, and as you can see from this slide, when parents were asked, they wanted them to be, healthy and happy, good physical and mental health. Actually, again, that really rests on all of these foundational things around self-regulation and those early relationships. So on the next slide, we can just see a few of these statistics. So even among parents of 0 to 5-year-old, recognition of the first 5 years as being the most important is low. 31% stating that this is the most important developmental period. So again, what we take from that is that we really, really need to support parents. We need to empower them. It's not, we need to give them that information about brain development and how they can really, really make that massive difference. And if you're interested in looking at any videos or additional research around this, the Harvard Center on the Developing Child has amazing resources that really explain this. Videos about how neural architecture is developed, really, really quite fascinating. So, as we can see, stark statistics, 7 in 10 parents, 69% are not aligned with this scientific consensus, this understanding of conception to 5 being so, so critical. And so on the next slide, furthermore, actually, parents are underestimating that particular important period of conception to 18 months as well. So again, we know that brain development during this time, it's so, so rapid. And actually, the most updated statistics from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child show that in that really early period of life, more than 1 million neural connections are being formed in the brain per second. Wow, that's absolutely massive. So we really need to kind of support parents with that right information, because this, and particularly with that focus on that birth to 2, massively important, because it impacts upon the life chances of babies far beyond these first few years. So actually, what does that look like? What does that mean? Well, it's again about responsive caregiving, as I sort of said before. So on the next slide, you can see like a little excerpt just from, so this is from the WHO guidelines. And actually, that's really fascinating that we've now got this body of evidence that actually really is saying, look, first and foremost, responsive caregiving, infants and children receiving that responsive care during the first 3 years of life. We have to be able to support parents. We have to enable people. We have to think about what are those structural issues that get in the way of this. What are those what is the anxiety, the other pressures? And we're right in the middle, or hopefully moving through the rest of the pandemic that has been such a tumultuous and turbulent period for so many people. But let's think about those young children that have been born during this period. Let's think about the pressures that parents have been under, new mums and dads, and all of those additional kind of issues that have really made such a massive impact. And I've been kind of using the phrase emotional bandwidth quite a lot, because I kind of feel like, if we're in this situation that is affecting the entirety of the world, and if our emotional bandwidth is kind of narrowed and we're buffering, then actually how can we give what we need to give to our children? So that's what's really important to acknowledge, isn't it? We've got all these systemic issues that we need to address, but the positive thing is that actually, if we know from the evidence base that responsive caregiving, and it's about, you know, what you do, not who you are, and if you can really empower parents to understand this information, then that's just so powerful and really does make a difference. On the slide that we've just moved back from, there is a link to a blog which is written by Julian Grenier, who is the head teacher of Sheringham Nursery School and Children's Centre and the director of the East London Research School. And it just summarises the Royal Foundation's State of the Nation report, the largest public study ever conducted, and actually really kind of pulls out some of those really key things. And again, that's on the Padlet, and we'll be putting that link in the chat. But the point is, we need to make sure we're thinking about how we support parents in the most effective way. Because actually, if we can really support people to understand that overwhelmingly a child's future is not predetermined at birth, that we can do something, then actually that's going to be really, really powerful. So Polly's just popped up a really great little video from Siren Films around self-regulation. And so just a really wonderful opportunity just to kind of reflect on the importance of self-regulation and look at a little bit of a journey from this young baby as children are developing. So just have a quick look at this clip. Issues. Just going to check the sound issues. Thank you for bearing with us.
The sound?
No, unfortunately not. What we can do is we can put this in the Padlet for people to watch at a later point if you would like to. The sound is useful to have, just kind of, but we can actually, yes, I know there is a way actually, isn't there, to kind of share the sound when you do your screen share. I don't know if maybe on the audio settings that might work. I'm just very mindful of time. Because we're really, really mindful of everybody's time, we will share it in the Padlet so that you have access to this video, and maybe one that you can share with your teams and go away and just reflect on everything that we've been thinking about today. So we've just got the last few kind of things to think about. So one of the things that we highlighted right at the sort of beginning of the session, which is newly sort of highlighted in the revised EYFS and in Development Matters, is self-regulation and executive function. And the term executive function may be new for many people, but it's very, it's about, you know, sort of the ability of the child to really think about, you know, key things like holding information in their minds, focusing their attention, thinking flexibly, cognitive flexibility, and being able to inhibit some of those impulses. And that's all part of being a self-regulated learner. They really kind of contribute to children's growing ability. So thinking about executive function, when do executive function skills grow most? And when do they decline? So just have a few moments to just think and pop your ideas in the chat. So we've got 2 to 4 decline around 70. An interesting point about thinking about, you know, the situations in which the child is given no freedom, they decline. Okay. Yeah. So executive functions. So I'm actually going to show you the next slide, which shows a really interesting trajectory. So can you see here? Executive function skills are building throughout the whole of childhood and adolescence. And again, on the Harvard website, there's a brilliant kind of graphic that shows just how powerful this is. Because actually, you know, brains are built, not born. And so actually it's mostly between that kind of 3 to 5. But, you know, you will start seeing some of these skills develop right from infancy. So I will also share this really great graphic that we've got that sort of just kind of highlights how it relates to how executive functioning relates to child development. You know, they're the set of skills that underlie the capacity to plan ahead, meet goals, really think about how to follow multi-step directions and instructions, keep focused. But the point is that the foundation is laid in infancy. And so it's all, again, about that responsive relationships. Relationships with responsive caregivers are so important. So something even as simple as playing peekaboo is going to help build those early foundations, that early foundation of working memory, which is a really important executive function. Self-control as the baby anticipates the surprise. So again, massively important to consider the role of the adult caregiver, parents, practitioners, in really providing these responsive, nurturing relationships that allow children to really build on all these absolutely vitally important skills through scaffolding, through really supporting all of those important, you know, it's life skills, isn't it? Enabling children to gradually manage more and more aspects of their environment. Okay, so I'm going to hand back over to Polly just for the last couple of slides, and just to be really thinking about some of those key things that we've covered today and thinking about what we will be looking at in the next session. Thanks so much, Polly.
Thank you, Fliss. Really useful and powerful stuff for thinking about our practice. Lovely concrete examples, and fantastic to hear about what is happening in your setting at the moment. So when we're talking about interactions, the barriers to self-regulation, it's not helpful to think about kind of blame or focus on the barriers. It is useful to think about what we can do that makes a difference in this context. So we can make a positive difference in the early years, and with the East London Research School and in the Education Endowment Foundation, really powerfully believe that we can address the problems of child poverty and poor housing. We can't leave this to early years and school settings alone. You know, there needs to be kind of collaboration on these issues for the children that we are serving. So I've got 1 minute left, I think, to recap quickly. So brains are built and not born. That's something that has come up throughout the different sections of these sessions. So Fliss talked about the stages of development, and Sarah talked very clearly, I think, about the different influences and the different potential of early brain development. The whole of the early years is a sensitive phase for the development of executive function. There are particular stages when it is you know, especially rapid, but it is critical from infancy. It's something that here it says we need to think about how we weave these approaches into our provision, and it's something that we talk about sometimes as a kind of a golden thread, so it goes throughout. It's not, although it is now an early learning goal that stands on its own, it's not something that can be totally separated out from the characteristics of effective learning or our work towards any of the other curriculum areas. There are things that have an impact on our children's self-regulation, including poverty, but it is what parents and professionals, practitioners do to support children that can really make the difference. And we can do that in our own practice. And I would love it between now and the next session, which is next Wednesday at slightly later time of 3:45, to have a look at the Early Education Foundation Education Endowment Foundation, sorry, Education Endowment Foundation's guidance report on self-regulation and metacognition. We'll share that with you, a link to it in the email that follows up from this session, but it is already in the Padlet, and we'll share that link to the Padlet with you as well in that email. So it would be great if you could have a chance to have a look over that report before the next session, because in the next session we'll pick apart some of that report in a little bit more detail, look at some of the implications of what we know about self-regulation in the early years for our practice and developing particular strategies, and it will be really helpful if you have had a chance to do some of that pre-reading as well. Please do connect with us. Here are the contact details for the East London Research School on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and our website as well. Fliss and I are also really happy to be contacted about any questions or feedback or thoughts that you may have. I shall not keep you any longer. Thank you so much for making the time in this twilight session. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Fliss and to Sarah for making the time to join us as well. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you so much, Polly. I have just put the Padlet link in the chat. It will get sent out to you, and I'll make sure that there's a few other things that we've kind of mentioned over the course of the session that will kind of be added. And what's brilliant about Padlet is that it allows us to kind of, you know, update in real time with things that people are particularly interested in. So thanks so much, and we'll put a recording up there as well.